The desert wind carried the sound of something small and crying, a faint whimper swallowed by the endless sand and the cold that fell after sunset, when the sky above the Montana plains turned bruised with fading light. Miles away from the nearest town, the coyotes called and the tumbleweed rolled against fences that had long since fallen apart, and there, between a dry creek bed and a dying cottonwood, something moved. A burlap sack, tied clumsily with a piece of frayed rope, trembled as though the earth itself were shivering. Inside it, a girl no older than 17, frail and half-starved, her lips blue from the cold, tried to breathe through the rough weave. She had no name that anyone cared to remember, her parents were long dead, and the people who had taken her in only wanted her to work until she broke. When she grew too weak to haul water, they said she was a burden. So they dragged her to the edge of nowhere, tied her inside that sack, and left her to the coyotes. She prayed softly, not for rescue, but for her pain to end quietly beneath the stars. Yet fate, as cruel as it was, had a strange way of turning the wheel one last time before it stopped completely. At the edge of the ranch called Hollow Creek, a cowboy named Eli Moore was putting his little daughter, Annie, to bed. Annie was 7, with curls the color of wheat and a heart too big for the world she was born into. Her mother had died the winter she was born, leaving Eli hollow but gentle, a man who worked from dawn to dusk with a sadness that never left his eyes. That night, when the wind howled and the horses grew restless, Annie tugged at her father's sleeve. "Papa," she whispered, "someone's crying outside." He paused, listening. Only the moan of the wind. "It's just the night talkin', sweetheart. Go on and sleep." But the little girl wouldn't. She rose, wrapped herself in her blanket, and went to the window. There, across the fence line, under the dying cottonwood, something moved again. Annie gasped softly. "Papa," she said, "there's a sack by the tree." Eli sighed, his bones weary from years of hard winters and harder memories, but something in her voice made him grab his lantern. He crossed the yard, the cold biting through his coat, the lantern swinging low as its weak flame fought the wind. When he reached the cottonwood, he heard it, a faint, muffled sob. He knelt and untied the rope. The sack fell open, and a girl spilled out like a ghost born of dust and tears. Eli froze. She was alive, barely. Her wrists bruised, her face pale as moonlight, her eyes fluttering open to reveal a soft gray, filled with terror and disbelief. "Please," she whispered, her voice no louder than a prayer, "don't send me back." For a long moment, Eli didn't know what to say. The world had given him too many things to bury, too many reasons not to hope. But Annie had followed him, her small hand clutching his coat. "Papa," she breathed, "she's cold. Can we take her home?" Eli carried the girl back, her weight little more than air. They laid her near the fire, and Annie covered her with her own blanket. The girl's name, when she found the strength to speak, was Clara. She didn't remember much, just darkness, hands that hurt, the feeling of being thrown away. Days passed before she could stand, and in those days, Annie never left her side. The child would hum softly, brush Clara's tangled hair, and bring her water, saying, "Papa says we help folks who need help. Mama would want that." And Clara would smile weakly, never daring to ask about that mother she'd never meet. Eli watched from the doorway, the way the girl's eyes softened when Annie spoke, the way his little girl laughed again for the first time in years. Something old and aching in his chest began to thaw, but he told himself it was just pity. Winter lingered longer that year. Clara grew stronger, learning to walk again, her frail hands growing calloused from helping around the ranch. She cooked simple meals, mended torn shirts, and sometimes stood at the edge of the field watching Eli saddle the horses, her eyes full of quiet gratitude. But every kindness reminded her of how undeserving she felt. She had been left to die, people like her weren't meant to be saved. Still, she loved how Annie called her, Miss Clara, in the morning and hugged her waist before bed. One night, as the firelight danced across the wooden floor, Annie looked up at Eli and said something that froze his breath. "Papa," she whispered, "she's Mama." He looked at his daughter, startled. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Annie smiled sleepily, her eyes half closed. "Mama sent her. I dreamed it," she said. "Take care of the girl in the sack. She's your mama now." Then she drifted off to sleep, her words hanging in the air like a ghost that would not leave. Eli sat long after the fire burned low, staring at Clara where she slept on the floor by the hearth. Her face, pale and gentle, looked peaceful for once. Something stirred in him, a warmth he hadn't felt since before his wife died. He hated himself for it, for letting a broken stranger fill the space his grief had hollowed out. But as days turned to weeks, he couldn't deny that the ranch had come alive again. Annie's laughter echoed through the house, and Clara's soft singing carried through the fields. For a while, he let himself believe that maybe God hadn't forgotten them. Then spring came, and with it, men from town. They were rough and mean-eyed, and when they saw Clara hanging laundry by the fence, one of them spat. "There she is. Thought you could hide, did ya?" Clara froze, color draining from her face. Eli came out of the barn, his hand on his revolver. "You got business here," the men sneered. "She's a runaway. Belongs to the McCready farm, been missing 2 months. They paid good money for her. She's property." Eli's jaw tightened. "Ain't no one property here." The men laughed. "You planning to fight over trash, cowboy?" Eli didn't answer. Annie had run out from the porch, clutching Clara's skirt, trembling. One of the men stepped forward, grabbing Clara's arm, and she cried out. That was enough. Eli raised his gun, voice steady. "You best let go." There was a tense silence before the men spat again and muttered, "You'll regret this," and rode off toward town. That night, Clara sat by the fire, shaking. "They'll come back," she whispered. "I should go." Eli knelt beside her. "You ain't goin' anywhere. This is your home now." Tears spilled down her cheeks, silent, painful. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you risk anything for someone like me?" Eli didn't know how to answer. Maybe because he saw himself in her, someone the world had left behind. Or maybe because Annie had called her, Mama, and in some strange way, it had felt true. But fate was cruel. A week later, the men returned with the sheriff. Laws back then didn't favor girls like Clara. She was dragged away despite Annie's screaming and Eli's protests. "Papa, don't let them take her." Annie sobbed, reaching out as Clara was pushed onto the wagon. Clara looked back once, eyes full of sorrow. "Tell her," she whispered to Eli, "I love her." Then the wagon rolled away, leaving only dust and silence. Eli tried to fight it, rode into town, begged the sheriff, but the McCreadys had money and power. They said Clara had run off with stolen goods, a lie no one cared to question. She was taken south, to a work camp, her hands bleeding in the fields under a sky that never seemed to end. Months passed. The ranch grew quiet again. Annie stopped laughing. Every night she asked, "Papa, when's Mama coming home?" And every night Eli had no answer. The seasons turned, and the land grew dry. Eli's hair grayed. Annie grew taller, but her eyes stayed sad. Then, one morning, years later, as dawn painted the horizon gold, he found a sack by the old cottonwood again. Inside wasn't a girl this time, but a bundle of letters, written in a shaky hand. The first one read, "To my little girl, Annie. I'm sorry I couldn't stay. Tell Papa I kept my promise. I loved you both more than life." The last letter was stained, the ink washed away by tears. The man who brought them said she'd died the week before, fever and heartbreak taking her before 25. Eli sat under the cottonwood, the letters trembling in his hands. Annie, now 12, knelt beside him, crying softly. "She kept her promise, Papa," she said. "She didn't leave us. She came home." And Eli, who had not wept since his wife's death, bowed his head and wept like a child. The wind carried their cries across the plains, the same wind that had once carried the faint sound of a girl in a sack, and though her body lay buried far away, her soul seemed to linger in the air, the scent of wildflowers after rain, the warmth in a dying fire, the love that never really leaves. And when night came, Annie dreamed again. In her dream, a woman with gray eyes knelt beside her, brushing her hair back. "Don't cry," she whispered. "Mama's here." When Annie woke, the house felt warm, the fire glowing soft as a heartbeat. Eli sat beside it, the letters open on his knee. He looked up at her, eyes shining with tears and love. "She's home, sweetheart," he said quietly. "She's home." The desert wind sighed through the cottonwood again, carrying with it a song only hearts could hear, one of sorrow, love, and all the things lost people leave behind when they are finally found.